Hello, everyone. It seems that people are entering our Zoom room, and it's time for me to begin another iteration of A+D Mondays, our weekly program that introduces our wider community of students, faculty, and community to the people and ideas and the movements and practices that most compel those of us who are associated at Berkeley, whether we are students, whether we're faculty, staff, or community members. Tonight, I should say, first of all, my name is Shannon Jackson. I'm Associate Vice Chancellor for the Arts and Design, and it's a privilege to welcome you again to this iteration of Monday Night. If you have been tuning in with us all week, or if you all semester, or if you have regularly attended our program for the last several years, you know that this program is usually hosted in the beautiful theater of BAM PFA, and that it is now online. And you also know that it is co-curated by a range of campus organizations, this year by the African American Student Development Office, by the Berkeley Center for New Media, the Department of Art Practice, the Department of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies, Cal Performances, Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, the College of Environmental Design, and many more campus organizations. Indeed, a few weeks ago, some of you might remember, we had the chance to welcome our new Dean of College of Environmental Design to one of his first public programs. Vishan Chakrabarta was in dialogue with Darren Walker, and tonight I'm very privileged to be introducing an event that welcomes our new Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism, Gita Anand. But I'll also remind you, or tell newcomers for the first time, that this series, co-curated by campus organizations from around the university, has a title, and the title is Together, Reinventing Politics, Reimagining Health. And we chose that title as a way to mark our shared interest in imagining new protocols and new creative forms and new expressive forms that respond to democratic change and to respond, obviously, to the incredible health challenges that we have locally and globally. I want to tell you more about our plan for the evening, but before I do, I also want to acknowledge the fact that this commitment to being together, to togetherness, has a politics, and that politics is made more urgent and poignant when we acknowledge the land on which UC Berkeley stands. UC Berkeley stands as a campus on the ancestral and unceded land of the Ohlone tribe. In acknowledging our situatedness in that landscape, we also acknowledge the fact that the Ohlone people are flourishing and active members of the Berkeley community and the Bay Area community more widely. Those of us who tune in every Monday night, whether we're community members, staff, faculty, or humanities 20 students who regularly tune in, believe this place to be a special place, UC Berkeley to be a special place, but we know that we are not the first to recognize, to settle, and to celebrate this exceptional space that we have the privilege of calling our campus. As it happens, the people who we are gathering tonight have some vested interests in helping us think deeply about the politics of gathering, where the politics of gathering is around the act of voting, the politics of gathering around other kinds of protocols that ensure the future of our democracy. And in particular, tonight, we have the chance to think about the role of journalism as an expressive form in advancing the goals of democracy, and of course now in making sure that we reinvent and reconnect to politics together in the best way possible. As I said earlier, we're particularly privileged, I feel particularly privileged to introduce for my first time our new Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism, Gita Anand, who is an award-winning journalist and author whose stories on corporate corruption won the Wall Street Journal, won for the Wall Street Journal, a Pulitzer Prize in 2002. And she was lead reporter in a series of healthcare articles that were also ended up making her a finalist in 2003. Somebody who has something to say both about politics and about health and about the economic contingencies that interfere or advance those goals. She has worked as a journalist for 27 years and most recently as foreign correspondent for the New York Times and for the Wall Street Journal in India. David Barstow will also be joining the conversation. He's the Riva and David Logan Distinguished Chair in Investigative Journalism at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism and a leader of the school's investigative reporting program. He was a senior writer at the New York Times and the first reporter to win 4 Pulitzer Prizes. David Thigpen is a curriculum designer and director of UC Berkeley's new-ish, I'll say, undergraduate journalism program. For undergraduates tuning in, this is something you might want to think more about. He has written for Time Magazine, Rolling Stone, and the New York Times. He also has a public policy research background and is a board member affiliated with the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto. Number of Berkeley alums there as well. Tamara Keith is a White House correspondent for NPR and co-host of NPR Politics podcast. On Mondays, she joins the PBS NewsHour for its weekly Politics Monday segment. Many of you have seen her. She previously covered Congress and business for NPR, and before that worked as a member of KQED, KPCC, WOSU, and she holds 2 degrees from Berkeley, one a BA in philosophy and also a master's of journalism from the J School. So I think tonight, a well-timed conversation, we can expect a timely conversation really about how journalists are covering the election and the leadership transitions ahead of us, as well as what the stakes of those transitions are for the country, for California, and for the healthy reinvention of our lives as local and global citizens. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the screen over to Gita with thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks so much, Shannon, for inviting us and for this wonderful introduction to tonight's discussion and to myself and my wonderful panelists. As you said, I'm Dean of the Journalism School. I just became Dean a month ago. I came to the school 2.5 years ago, straight from being a foreign correspondent in South Asia, where I had covered the region for, as you said, the New York Times, and before that, the Wall Street Journal. But I began my career at small newspapers. I'm passionate about local journalism. I began covering zoning board meetings and school board meetings at a free shopper on Cape Cod. I then covered city government in tiny Rutland, Vermont for the Rutland Herald, and then politics at the Boston Globe, covering City Hall and the State House, and then became an investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal, a foreign correspondent, and then decided I really wanted to teach and write books, and came here to Berkeley to teach one of those unique courses that only Berkeley has. Berkeley has for 15 years had an India reporting class at the Graduate School of Journalism, where Berkeley hosts a journalist from India to teach graduate journalism students about international reporting, about India, and to take them over to India to each report a fresh story. So I came here to teach that class. And while I was here, Berkeley, the journalism school was recruiting a permanent faculty member. So because I was here or en route, I decided to apply for the permanent faculty position. And I was selected after a search and became a permanent faculty member in the middle of 2018. Teaching was new to me, but I found I absolutely loved it. And that's what I thought I was going to continue to do for my entire rest of my career. It happened, though, that I was asked to be on the search committee to find a new chair of investigative reporting. And our search committee identified David Barstow as the best candidate for that job and recruited him to come here to be head of the investigative reporting program. And David and I had this vision of making investigative reporting core to the curriculum at the Graduate School of Journalism and making investigative reporting much more inclusive. So I decided, and David invited me to be interim chair, to interim director, and partner with him in changing the investigative reporting program. And that was my entry into administration. He and I had such a great partnership and found we could make so much important change that I began to get excited about the potential to change the student experience and create new opportunities for students, particularly when COVID struck in March. And the two of us led the transformation of the journalism school into a newsroom covering COVID for the New York Times. We partnered with the New York Times. The fact that we could do this in 1 week made me see what's possible for our journalism school and for journalism. And so in June, when our dean decided to resign and I was asked to be interim dean, I was not only really excited, but raising my hand and saying, when can I start? It was, as you all know, an incredible moment in this country, a moment of racial reckoning in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing. And our students, as I'm sure many of you were doing in your different departments, were asking us to do better, saying, we want you to address systemic racism at the journalism school. And so I came in as interim dean with that as a mandate, and then immediately involved the students, staff, alumni, and faculty in the act of responding to the National Association of Black Journalists local chapter, which had made many requests of us. We formed working groups, and over the last 4 or 5 months, we've come up with a plan, and we formed a steering committee made up of some of our harshest critics, who we've asked to hold us accountable for implementing the plan. That is a huge part of what I've been doing the last few months. But at the same time as I've been doing that, I've been working to pivot the school toward having more of a focus on publishing. We had such a phenomenal experience for our students in covering COVID for the New York Times that we decided that it was critical for our students to have more publishing opportunities. And I'm thrilled to say that David Barstow, who is one of our panelists, as you know, led the way in creating new partnerships for our students to cover the election for Cal Matters, KQED, and other publications. I'm going to ask David if he will speak now. Tell us, David, what it was like. David, I'm sure you all know, one of his key Pulitzers was for the longest story, I believe, that the New York Times has ever published, and it was on Trump's taxes. So David came from covering Trump's taxes to the journalism school to teach students investigative reporting. And I think you all want to know, just as I do, what it was like coming from, a nearly 30-year career as an investigative reporter, covering some of the toughest stories of our times, to teaching journalism to our students. So let me turn it over to you, David.
Thank you, Gita. Oh boy, what a change. But I have to say, when you've written the longest story in the history of the New York Times, it really is time to sort of move on. You're not gonna probably top that one. I think it's been a remarkable journey for me. I've been here now for a little over a year, and the main reason why I wanted to come to Berkeley is, I think, like as all of us, I'm sure, have been feeling in recent years, the terrible cost to our country and our politics and our sense of togetherness when we're unable to agree on a common set of facts, a common set of truths, and we've seen the price of that in our politics, certainly in the last few months. And so I had been watching this and witnessing this really from my perch at the New York Times, and felt like I wanted to do something about that. And I wanted to do something more than simply continue writing big investigative stories for the New York Times. What I wanted to do is I wanted to find recruits for truth, recruits for fact, for a world based on fact. And I just could not think of a better place to come hunt for those recruits than Berkeley Journalism. And not only did I want to find recruits for truth in a world built and based around truth and fact, but I also had another objective in mind, which was I also wanted to do something about a problem that has been endemic to journalism for many decades now, and that is the failure on the part of news organizations to build staffs that reflect the communities that they cover. And I thought I could think of no better place, given the diversity of the student body and the brilliance of the student body at Berkeley Journalism, as a place to try to find brilliant minds, a diverse group of students who I might try to lure and persuade and cajole to maybe take up the crazy life of being an investigative reporter. And so that's what I jumped into coming to Berkeley. Like Gita, I had not been a professor or a teacher before. This was something that was new to me, and yet I have found the being here has been one of the most exciting times of my entire career. And one of the things that's true of many professions, but it's certainly most true with journalism, is that the best way to learn how to do this and do it well is to actually go out and write stories and find stories and tell stories. That is at the core of what Gita and I have been trying to do at Berkeley Journalism and with the investigative reporting program, is find ways to have our students basically jump into the deep end and be part of covering the biggest stories of our time. And so that is why we formed a partnership about a month before the election with a couple of different news outlets, including Cal Matters, which is a fabulous news organization. It's one of the newer ones that really leads the way in coverage of California politics and policy. We put a call out to our students. We said, do you want to be part of covering this election, right? I mean, what bigger story has there been other than the pandemic this year than the election? And lo and behold, many dozens of our students put up their hands. They absolutely wanted to find a way to be part of covering the election. And so over the span of really about 3 weeks, our students published over 45 stories about the election. 27 of our students were published writing about the election, and writing in particular about one of the core issues of this particular election, which was about the integrity of the vote, the integrity of voting systems, the problems of disinformation, the problems of voter intimidation, the problems of trying to vote during a pandemic. And our students jumped into that lane of coverage and really focused about how this election actually played out in the state of California. This was the first all mail-in ballot election in the state of California, and it was a fabulous experience for our students. They learned a lot. We've also identified some very interesting lines of reporting that we're going to begin investigating in the weeks and months ahead, which is very exciting. And this is part of of what I think sets Berkeley journalism apart, is this focus on having our students actually like produce and execute journalism that matters about big stories. This was certainly the case in the work we did on the pandemic. Yes, we teamed up with the New York Times. We've had, over the span of about a 6-month period of time, we've had nearly 50 of our students have been published in the New York Times, writing about the pandemic. Can you imagine? And best of all, I think roughly half of those students have been students of color. And the great thing about this partnership with the New York Times, and you can actually see it in you looking at the stories that are scrolling in front of you right now, when other publications saw that the New York Times was publishing our work, they wanted in on the action as well. And so our students began publishing not just with the New York Times, but with National Geographic, with The Atlantic, with Rolling Stone, with KQED. We had a great series that ran on Frontline. It's been a kind of an explosion of publishing that's happened here, and some very important stories. And I'd love to just, if I can, take 1 minute to talk about one story that I'm proud of. We had a number of our students ended up on page 1 of the New York Times. Can you imagine going to college for journalism and you wake up one morning and there you are on page 1 of the New York Times? Here is Daniel Lempres, who's a second year student right now at Berkeley Journalism, holding up the front page of the New York Times, and in the bottom right-hand corner is his name over a story, along with several other of our students who wrote a very important story about how during the pandemic, child welfare workers in the state of California have in many cases kind of retreated from the front lines of investigating child abuse allegations. And so this was an amazing experience for our students to not only do stories that would be publishable in the New York Times, but we've had at least 8 of our students on page 1 of the New York Times writing stories, that are incredibly important and impactful. And it's a great example, I think, of the approach that we're taking, that Gita has been leading the way on, in terms of making Berkeley journalism a place where, if you want to learn how to fight for facts and fight for truth and fight for a kind of a sense that society is really lost if we can't basically agree on a common set of facts, this is a place that will help you learn how to do that. And I'm thrilled to have been a part of it. It's been a total blast coming here. I'm so happy that I've come. Yes, every now and again, I miss doing the reporting that I did at the New York Times. But what makes up for it is the thrill that I get when I see our brilliant students winding up making a very important contribution to very big stories. And with that, I'll turn you back to you, Gita.
Thank you, David. I'm going to introduce our next panelist, David Thigpen, who, as Shannon told you, is the head of our summer undergraduate minor, and a former writer for Time and other publications. And what David has done is he is leading a pilot class this semester, which is teaching, in which a group of students, his students, are reporting on extremism and white supremacy, and at the same time teaching students cybersecurity techniques to protect themselves from being attacked as they report on extremism. we want at the journalism school to make sure students are learning the cutting edge techniques to do reporting safely and do the reporting that's needed safely. And reporting on the web is key. And it's so dangerous. With that, let me turn it over to David and just ask you the first question, which really is, and I know you'll talk about some of the stories and one in particular, but first just tell us what it's like to be leading a group of students covering extremism.
Yes, thank you, Gita. And yeah, hello to the audience. I'm really glad to be here. So this was really exciting and a tremendous challenge. Covering extremism. Extremism really has emerged in the U.S. Well, certainly in the last 2 decades. But as we approach the election, I think everyone saw all kinds of incidents occurring. So earlier in the year, Professor Barstow and Dean Anand had thought that this would be a good topic that we could use for our introductory reporting course, J200. It was a wonderful choice and just an exciting journey for our students because they've plunged into some very deep online investigations of extremist groups like the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys. They've done some incredible entrepreneurial reporting and additional online investigations and turned up some very interesting information. And it's so important that journalists be able to cover these movements in great detail, because they tell something about where we are as a country. They also reveal the plans that these groups have, and many of them, some of them want to overthrow the US government, but they tell a lot about us as a country and where we are now. So I had a wonderful group of students. The course finishes actually in 2 weeks, but 13 students from the US, 1 student who lives in Nairobi, Kenya, another student who lives in Rome, and they were both able to report on extremist movements in those countries, and we were able to compare the two with US movements. We broke our students up into different beats, so some covered race-based extremism here in the US, some covered religious-based extremism, we covered gender-based extremism, and so I think the students really enjoyed it. It was also very intense and challenging because some of our investigations require students to go online into chat rooms where extremists talk, and they talk frankly, and sometimes they even make plans. And so we were able to observe extremists as they talk and as they behave. So this was a really powerful experience. I'm sure everyone remembers when the president gave a shout out to the Proud Boys during a presidential debate. And I absolutely thought that was a big turning point in the US to have a voice sitting in the White House to shout out in a positive way an extremist group that wants to do damage to other Americans. So that was just an incredibly powerful moment. We also covered, there was a QAnon favoring candidate here in California. In fact, there were 4 running for Congress, and that was a remarkable story that one of our students worked on. And so when I say a QAnon favoring candidate, these are candidates that retweet QAnon content. And if you ask them, do they support the QAnon movement, depending on the day, they'll say yes. So we saw politicians in California using an extremist movement to help accelerate their own political fortunes. So that was rather remarkable. So let me talk about some of the other stories that our students did. One prominent extremist group that's been making lots of news are called Boogaloo Boys. I'm sure many of you have heard them mentioned. So one of our students wrote a story about an Oakland Police Department officer who was seen during a police action in Oakland wearing what is considered a signal boogaloo symbol, which is the Hawaiian shirt. And that caused confusion in the community. There was a police raid, and this officer was leading the raid, and people in the community were not sure just what this officer's story was. We did a piece about a researcher at Georgetown University who's working on a theory that he calls attitudinal inoculation. In other words, can you inoculate people against adapting extremist ideas at a young age? Very controversial idea, but an interesting story. Another story about something called digital prison in Korea, basically kind of a vigilante website which doxes people that they accuse of committing sex crimes and other kind of gender-based crimes. We did a story about the man in Brentwood, California, who just before the election hanged outside his house an effigy of the president-elect. So anyway, we had a marvelous array of stories. There's one story in particular I wanted to mention before I stop, and that was Bakersfield, California. So 3 of our students did some real great entrepreneurial reporting and exposed kind of a running conflict between Black Lives Matter protesters and a group of pro-Trump protesters who called themselves the 1776 Patriots. And the 2 groups would kind of vie for public space and would push each other around. And there were actually 3 arrests because they brandished weapons. And it's a great story. It kind of reflected how deeply the kind of animus, political animus that we're seeing in the country goes on. But the students did some really entrepreneurial reporting in tracking down a young woman who said she was intimidated by the 1776 Patriots. She recorded some of it, put it online. Our reporters were able to find her. We were able to find also some additional information about some of the 1776 Patriots using kind of open source investigations and revealed some things that are going to lead to additional stories. I just wanted to add that for reporters today investigating extremist groups, it's necessary that they take precautions because some of the extremist groups will and have retaliated against reporters. We had a guest reporter come speak to our class. She's a writer for Vice magazine, and she said the first extremist protest she covered, she wound up phoning on her cell phone one of the leaders of the movement, and he passed her cell phone number on to his comrades, and she began to get hundreds of death threats on coming into her by text to her phone. So we understood very clearly that you've got to take precautions. So working with the Citizen Clinic of the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity here at UC Berkeley, our students were equipped with tools to protect themselves as they report, so they can go into chat rooms and not be retaliated against, and so they will not fall victim to extremists who want to intimidate and block important reporting about their activities. Okay, that's all.
Thanks, David. I so appreciate your taking us through the story and your students' work and your class, and I'm sure the audience does too. I'm going to introduce and invite Tamara Keith, who's an alum of our school and at the White House, covering the White House for NPR, on the front lines of covering politics and this election. And ask you, Tamara, if you can talk about what it's like trying to cover the White House when you're being attacked as an enemy of the people, and also how NPR's coverage of the president has changed over these 4 years, and how you see journalism having changed in response to covering this unique president.
Yeah, so I am at my house, not the White House at the moment, because, hey, we're in a pandemic, though I was at the White House on Friday. And, you know, I have to say, on a day-to-day basis, being an enemy of the people doesn't really change the way I do my job. President Trump made it clear pretty early on that when he calls something fake news, it's just a story he doesn't like. And certainly have never sought his approval or the approval of any politician. The things I dread the most are when my stories end up in like the press release that a politician sends out about, you know, whatever their issue is. Look at this story, it's been covered by NPR. That is like my worst nightmare. I don't want to be something that any politician wants to promote. But you know, that isn't to say that the enemy of the people language isn't dangerous. It absolutely is dangerous. You know, it doesn't change day to day the questions that I ask or the stories that I write. I think it's more dangerous in other parts of the world where the president's language has been echoed by dictatorial regimes and others that want to do harm to journalists and journalism, or want to you know, denigrate the credibility of journalism. And of course, here domestically, President Trump has done a really great job of accelerating something that's been happening for a long time. And it certainly is not all on him. We in journalism have a lot of blame ourselves, but the degradation of the trust in the institution of journalism. I mean, certainly our institution has not been helped by having a president who treats us, at least publicly, as the opposition party. I mean, the real irony of it all is that President Trump is, you know, an approval-seeking creature who absolutely, you know, if he could just get a good headline in the New York Times, it would make his day. You know, he doesn't. He actually knows the bylines. He knows all the reporters on all the cable networks. He knows who he's calling on because he consumes their content voraciously. And so it's this very it's this strange dichotomy where you have, you know, the sort of the tweeting president, the public persona of someone who hates the press, but who really only wants good press. And if he could just get good press, he actually loves the press and he wants the approval of the press corps. It's this very strange relationship. And the other thing that, you know, I think as we move into a Biden administration, there will be things, believe it or not, about President Trump that we miss, including his, I mean, except for the last however many days, 20 days it's been since the election. Up until then, he had a complete and total inability to not answer a question. I mean, don't get me wrong, he frequently did not answer the question in a truthful way. But he really left no thought unuttered between his tweets and between what he'd say at Chopper Talk, or if you got him in the briefing room or in the Oval Office lobbing questions in his direction. I mean, it became this thing, which this is like sad to even think about, but you know, if you're trying to confirm that some person in the White House has coronavirus, like including the president of the United States, but you know, people were trying to confirm whether Hope Hicks had his press aide, whether Hope Hicks had tested positive for coronavirus, and you know, Bloomberg had the story. Everybody's trying to confirm it, and you know, we weren't succeeding at confirming it. And I think I even said to my editor, like, the president's going to be on Hannity. If Hannity asks about it, like, the president is not going to worry about concealing private health information. This is going to get out. And lo and behold, he was like, oh yeah, Hope, she tested positive. Oh, and I've taken a test. We'll find out the results. And then that led to that 1 a.m. phone call. Yeah, in terms of the enemy of the people stuff, it has created an interesting challenge, but I think, here in the United States, we have been, as reporters, we still have the privilege of reporting fearlessly. Whereas in other countries, when the president or the prime minister calls journalists enemy of the people or fake news, they have to worry about going to prison. And that, much as the president doing this extended thing where he is not conceding despite what is obvious, and world leaders calling the president-elect to congratulate him, just as that does harm to America's ability to preach about free and fair elections in the rest of the world, the enemy of the people talk does make it harder for America to tell other countries how to treat the free press, or to have a free press. And your other question, was about how journalism has changed. So absolutely, very early on, we realized at NPR and obviously everywhere else that we had an incredible challenge. In the Obama administration, there was that thing where they said, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor, and it was it's the lie of the year, or the falsehood of the year, and the Obama administration, their spokespeople, the president, everybody was sort of scrambling to say, no, it didn't end up being true, but here's how we meant it to be true. And there was this sense that they did not want to be caught in a falsehood, and that there was shame. And there has been no shame for the entire Trump presidency. I mean, there's a pile of fact checks up to the ceiling, and it doesn't matter. The president, for instance, has repeated, I don't know how many times, that he signed VA choice. He got VA choice. And that was, Bernie Sanders and John McCain, and signed by President Obama. But, in President Trump's telling, it was all him. And he wasn't even a candidate yet. So we realized early on that we were dealing with something very different, where the normal means of reporting and writing about something didn't work. And so I'm in broadcast media, I'm in the radio business. So there's also this challenge where if you go to fact check something, then if you put that thing on the air, and I guess this is true in print too, but when you go to fact check something, you are actually amplifying the falsehood. And there is a risk in that too. And so what we developed at NPR, what I turned to very quickly, and there wasn't like there was a room where we all got together and brainstormed this, but what I figured out very quickly is that we had to do something called a fact sandwich. So best case scenario, you don't put something on the air that's false. You find something else to put on the air, or, but in many cases, the president saying something false was in fact the news. And so then how do you deal with that? Well, you do the sandwich. You write into the clip saying that the president falsely claimed, or erroneously this, or whatever language you use to sort of couch it. And then immediately afterwards, you say, in reality, or some other way of bluntly making clear that what you just heard wasn't true, and here's what the truth is. And, at the core, we are in the truth business. I mean, we don't have to be militant about it, but we're in the truth business. And so helping our audience understand what the truth is in any given situation is incredibly important. And trying to figure out ways to write about the truth, to write about the fact that the president is saying something that isn't true, without also amplifying it in a way that accomplishes what he wanted anyway, has been an interesting challenge. And I think that, I mean, if you look at the Washington Post, the New York Times, all of the major LA Times, all of these major outlets that cover the White House, the way they are writing about this president is different than the way they've written about other presidents. And I'm not, to turn to the future, which is what I think people are here to hear about. I don't know what happens when you return to a very conventional presidency. And by all accounts, we are on our way to returning to a very conventional presidency. Joe Biden, thus far, every announcement he has made of a member of his cabinet or a member of his staff, you go, oh, yeah, of course. And these are people who are, public policy and political professionals, people who have experience in national security and diplomacy. I mean, these are deeply experienced people. This is going to be completely and totally different from what we've covered for the past 4 years, and much more like what we covered for the 8 years before that, or even the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, the second Bush administration. The sort of level of professionalism is going to be very different, and the way stories get told, there are every story I see these days, and I mean, I'm experiencing it too, I just haven't put it in the stories, but the Biden people run a remarkably leak-free operation, people keep writing, and it's true. Thus far, it's been a remarkably leak-free operation. I mean, when they picked Kamala Harris to be the vice presidential pick, I learned about it from a text message from the campaign, just like everyone else who had signed up for text messages from the campaign, which is quite possibly the first time in presidential history that they have urged everyone to sign up for the text messages, and those people actually did learn at the same time as the reporters. I'll stop talking and you can ask the question.
No, thanks so much, Tamara, and we hope to continue to discuss what it's been like to cover the election, and how journalism has changed and how we're likely to see it change going forward. We're going to have times for Q&A for the last 15 or 20 minutes of this conversation. So please start sending questions. I'll be seeing them and reading them out, which is the format for a webinar, which this is. But meanwhile, let me invite the other two panelists to join us in continuing this conversation. And let me ask David Barstow, who has done some tough reporting on President Trump's taxes, about the New York Times, where he spent 15 years, or I'll let him say how many years, and how its reporting or its conventions for doing reporting changed during these 4 years, because he was part of many of those dialogues. And then David, just look ahead to the future.
Yeah, I mean, I did a story just before the 2016 election that explored Donald Trump's difficulty with truth. And I remember like the backflips that we went through with that story to avoid using the word lie. So we like deception, false statement, like it was like we were like going to the dictionary looking for anything other than the word lie. And it felt silly actually at the time, I remember, because he had such a long history, well-documented history of saying things that were just total whoppers. And he would be corrected and he would still tell them. It's all the stuff we've seen over the last 4 years. And then even when we wrote a story, we wrote this 14,000 word story saying that the President Trump had committed tax fraud and that he had gotten vastly more money from his father than he had ever let on. It was a hugely complex, difficult story. And yet the biggest disagreement I had with Dean Baquet, the editor of the New York Times, in that whole story was about whether one time we would say that he had lied, right? That he using the lie word, right? And if you look at the New York Times in the last few months, you will see like it is a very changed institution, and it's because exactly what Tamara was just saying, right? Which is that I think the Washington Post, the New York Times, all of the other what Margaret Sullivan would call the reality-based press, right? Felt like, at some point you can't be sort of neutral, right? About how you cover a press conference at which Sidney Powell, the president's attorney, at least she was at that moment, is spelling out the most fantastical conspiracy theories that have absolutely no factual basis underneath them. And you've seen a really dramatic shift, really in the last, I would say even in the last 12 months. I think at the Washington Post, at the New York Times, a much greater willingness to really just call it like it is, and don't pull punches, right? But actually like be assertive about basically describing the world as it is and not doing the false equivalence thing, right? I mean, the false equivalence thing has been the death of good journalism for a long time. The sort of like the, that he said, she said kind of journalism. And what I've noticed is that willingness. I mean, it was a very big deal in a journalist's career to write a story that said a major political figure had told a falsehood, right? That used to be like a very big deal. If you did that once a year, you'd pat yourself on the back. And we entered into this world where you were doing that every 10 minutes. You were saying that the president of the United States was lying or telling a falsehood. And that has, that's forced us as journalists in this democracy to really ask some very fundamental questions about how we do what we do. And I have no doubt that that the Biden administration at some point along the way is going to say something that is not factually correct. And I'll tell you what, I will not. I have no doubt in my mind that that Tamara and everyone else who's covering the White House will be very quick to call BS on Biden. And in some ways, I think the willingness to go there and to call BS has been strengthened in some ways. I hope it's been strengthened in some ways. Our willingness as sort of the reality-based journalist to just call BS on nonsense, on conspiracies, on factual misstatements that get made over and over and over again. But I'd love to hear what Tamara's, I mean, what do you anticipate? It's going to happen.
Oh, yeah. Well, so this is not a good example of calling BS on falsehoods, but the Joe Biden on Saturday decided he wanted to go to mass at the last second in the evening after the press pool, the protective pool that is supposed to go wherever the president goes or wherever the president-elect goes. And that pool is important because if something were to happen, you want an independent account of what the president is doing or has done. So he basically accidentally, I don't know, whatever, he ditched the pool. They couldn't get the pool together fast enough because people were, not swept, and they had to get Secret Service swept and all this. So, that's a violation of protocol. It's not the biggest deal in the world, but, it's not a great way to start. And so I complained about it. And, Trump had just done, like a month ago, Trump went on his joyride around Walter Reed and ditched the pool. And it was a similar scenario in that the people who wrangle the press were told, you won't see the president today. And so they sent the press home, and then they couldn't find the press to see the president going on his joyride. Anyway, all this is to say, I complained mildly about Biden ditching the pool. And, that is a level of, we need to hold the Biden administration accountable in the same way that we hold the Trump administration accountable, in the same way we hold the Obama administration accountable. And the liberal backlash was unbelievable. It was like, oh my gosh, it wasn't on purpose. You're just both sidesing this. And it was sort of a remarkable, like, oh, this is going to be the new thing, where if Biden does anything slightly wrong, people are going to be like, oh, come on, he's not Trump, leave him alone. But I actually suspect that in time, Biden will no longer be the anti-Trump. Biden will be Biden. He will be the president of the United States, held accountable by the American people. The American people will have expectations for him beyond just like not being the other guy. Ultimately, the press will be there to report on successes and failures. Certainly, during the Obama administration, there were not the kind of scandals that plagued the Trump administration. I mean, things like Solyndra are kind of quaint in light of the things that happened during the Trump administration. But there will be billions of dollars in theory, if Congress gets its act together. There will be billions of dollars in bailout funds. There will be distribution of vaccines and PPE, and there will inevitably be errors. I mean, this is a huge operation. And we will be there to cover those errors. I mean, certainly we will cover successes too, but I don't think that anyone's under the illusion that a Biden administration is going to come in and, solve all the problems and be absolutely perfect. They won't. They will screw up too. And we're there to ask those tough questions, to ask questions in the briefing room that they don't want to answer. I sincerely hope that whoever is picked as the press secretary will actually put something resembling policy and answers in that binder that they bring in. I will say that one large frustration that I had with the Trump administration, in addition to the lack of regular briefings, was also the complete and total lack of effort to come to those briefings with any policy information or anything factual. I mean, they were truly just there as entertainment. And I like, that's not my idea of entertainment. My hope is that in a Biden administration, they will make an effort. I've talked to press secretaries from past administrations about, what the purpose of the briefings are. And the briefings have a significant purpose. I mean, in a way, they are the voice of the American government to the world from that briefing room. It's symbolic. And I know past press secretaries have felt a lot of pressure to come into that room and have something to say, to have an answer on the thorniest of possible issues. And these former press secretaries have told me that the process of having to have an answer, where you go to the president or you go to the chief of staff or you go to whoever it is and say, no, they're going to ask about this and I need to be able to answer them. So we need to come up with a defensible policy. The act of that briefing and having to come up with a defensible policy makes the government function better. So, I mean, like, I do hope that they will decide that they want to have a defensible answer.
I want to ask David Thigpen and all of you really, how you think the press will handle Trump going forward. In some ways, journalism was a facilitator of Trump as the bright, shiny thing. I'm drawing actually from some audience questions even that we'll move over to, but people are asking this, and this is sort of something I've always wondered, like, what has journalism learned from excessive coverage of the bright and shiny thing to be more moderated and thoughtful about how much coverage to give bizarre behavior and what is fair? But David Thigpen, I'll let you start.
I think that's an extremely important point. And that's really what got a lot of journalism into big trouble during the Trump administration, because he's such an adept manipulator of media, which is how he became a famous person, and is such an adept manipulator, and he really just is able to dictate the news cycle in a way that was just appalling. So and we're in trouble sort of generally, because our whole information sphere is now seen as kind of a battlefield, right? It's and in many cases less so a field for news and reality, but like a battlefield where outrageous conspiracy theories are floated, and conservative ideas clash with liberal ideas. It's just this, it's the values of entertainment have kind of infected a lot of news coverage. So I'm just hoping that has not become a norm in news coverage. And I don't like to talk about the media in general, because that's too big a net. You've got hundreds of newspapers that all function differently. We've got social media. We've got television news. So it's misleading to characterize it in a single way. But we really have to be careful that this does not become a norm, because it really has compromised the way information gets processed in the U.S. and really put us in a hole. So going forward with Trump, we have to understand, is he still yanking our chain or not? Is there actually something substantive in what he's saying, or is it non-substantive and it's just another way to poke the media to get a reaction? And I hope that we've come to that realization. I will say that there's a lot of media that depends on high circulation and large dollar volume advertising. They need hits, and they need eyes. So their concern about those kind of long range issues are probably not the same as that we have in this room.
David, Barstow, or Tamara, do you want to add to it? I mean, particularly focusing on whether, like, what the learning was in the coverage of the intensive coverage of sort of, I mean, I'm overstating it, but of every crazy thing or outrageous thing that President Trump covered, during the campaign in 2016 and then throughout his presidency.
One thing I've been thinking about is what the post-presidency looks like, and I also think that I'm thinking about the tweets, and I want to take you through my lengthy thought process that I won't go on about forever, but about the tweets, which is, early on in the Trump presidency, we were all still operating under the old rules, where if the president of the United States says something in any format, then that is actionable, reportable news. And President Trump was saying things in tweets that appeared to be statements of policy. For instance, the ban on transgender people in the military that he announced in a tweet, and then where our Pentagon correspondent is asking around the Pentagon, and they're like, we have no idea what the hell's going on. You've got to ask the White House. Ultimately, months later, those tweets did become policy. And so we were sort of in this balancing act of trying to figure out which tweets were news and policy, and which tweets were a dude in his 70s watching Fox and Friends and tweeting his thoughts. And it was often really hard to differentiate between the two. And I think that early on, every tweet was a 5-alarm fire. And then over time, we sort of recalibrated and realized that this really is a president who leaves no thought unuttered. This is a guy who will say a lot of things that are not necessarily based in any sort of policy. They aren't thought out. He's just saying what he's thinking, and sometimes that leads to something, and sometimes that doesn't lead to something. And so as we move towards the post-presidency, and there is extensive reporting that he is likely to either say he's running or tease that he's running, or actually run again, I think we in the press have to figure out how to deal with the tweets. And one thing that will change on January 21st is that those tweets are no longer government policy. Those tweets are the thoughts of a guy who owns a lot of golf courses, used to be president, maybe a candidate, but candidate tweets and candidate statements are not a 5-alarm fire. They're just not. They don't require wall-to-wall coverage. Now, what I don't know is, though I suspect I know, at NPR, we don't have all the airtime in the world. We have a few programs, we have hourly newscasts. We don't have 24/7 to fill with talking like they do on cable. And certainly cable, both, you watch Fox, and it's like all outrage, and they're still talking about how Antifa or whoever it was disrupting the pro-Trump protesters a week and a half ago. And on MSNBC, it's what latest outrage did President Trump do? And guess what? Outrage works. It gets eyeballs, it gets clicks, it gets people to keep watching. So will the outrage machine continue? Will Trump just continue to fuel the outrage machine? I don't know, but I think probably, at least in some realm, yes. I don't know, David, you're nodding.
Oh, that it's his only platform of influence and power now. So I'm quite convinced that he is going to migrate his audience to some of the more extreme social media platforms that we now see appearing, including Parler, and I think one called DLive. And they're going to amass large audiences, and that's going to be his political base, for which, if he's facilitated through the media, he'll be able to fire shots at whatever administration is in place to weaken the policy agenda of that administration. I mean, this is his strategy. I'm sure, and he'll harness all that resentment that's out there, and that's what this we're going to overturn the election was all about. Because without that rage, he's nowhere. So we've really got to be very careful and ask ourselves: are we going to facilitate this like we facilitated the last 4 years, or are we going to treat this differently? And I'm not saying censorship or anything like that. I'm saying we've got to really understand like what is genuinely news and what's not. When is he jerking our chain and when is not? And if he's always jerking our chain, then do we have to cover that, right? Are there alternatives to cover it? And do we need to repeat his tweets, right? Do we need to cover his speeches from stem to stern? I really hope not, because arguably we're participating in our own destruction by doing that.
Well, and if he migrates, or he and his base, which is what, 74 million people, maybe not all of them are truly part of the base, but they voted for him. If they migrate to other places that, I mean, criticize Fox as much as you want, they do have some element of their staff who are still bound by the rules of journalism as we know them. Mm-hmm. If all of that migrates to another platform that isn't bound by any of the rules of journalism, for instance, OAN in a fight between the press corps and the Trump White House actually filed a friend of the court brief with the White House, mm-hmm. rather than with the reporters. Yeah. So if that happens, then I mean, as a country, are we just moved to even fewer shared facts and realities?
Yeah. Well, I would ask this question too. If he is putting forward anti-democratic ideas and trying to strengthen anti-democratic processes, then what are we participating in by sharing that with mass audiences?
I would say, actually, the question of how he fits into our future really revolves ultimately on decisions that get made by three human beings: Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, and Rupert Murdoch. I think, like, if those three make decisions that, you know what, we're not going to aid and abet disinformation. We're not going to aid and abet conspiracy theories. We're not going to back off of calling Arizona. It was a very interesting moment last week on Fox News when Tucker Carlson was mildly critical of Sidney Powell for failing to show proof of some of the conspiracy theories. And there was an enormous backlash from the conservative establishment, media establishment, against Tucker Carlson for calling out the lack of evidence. I think this, to me, I'm as much as I worry about, how do we cover Trump in the post-presidency, especially if he is saying he's a candidate and that freezes the field, and then he basically is still the Republican Party, and with a very loyal base, 3/4 of whom now actually agree with him, according to recent polling, that the election was stolen. To me, the deeper and harder and tougher question is really about the kind of how we deal as a profession with the vast spread of disinformation through the sort of perfect delivery devices for spreading disinformation, which is social media networks. And that's why what Mark Zuckerberg decides and what Jack Dorsey decides are so important and crucial in deciding what kind of information system we live in the coming months. That's who I'm really interested in focusing on journalistically in the coming months, is looking at what moves those guys make. Yes, OAN, some people will migrate to OAN, but it's still relatively small potatoes, as is Newsmax. Parler is relatively small potatoes compared to what Facebook is and what Twitter is at this moment. And YouTube, for that matter. YouTube is another very important player in this. So the people who run those platforms, right, how they react to disinformation, especially when they're facing enormous pressure from conservatives who are accusing them of censorship and accusing them of tilting the playing field. That I think is gonna tell a lot about where we are as a country in a couple of years' time.
I'm going to move to some questions now. We have lots of questions. Here's a first one, and I'll leave it. I'd be eager for one or more of your thoughts. This question is, how do we promote the role of professionally trained journalists in a context where everyone is a journalist in this social media environment? And two, how does the medium by which people receive their news, print, online, podcast, film, affect the content they receive? So who would like to tackle that?
I would say the format is extremely influential because most young people get their news on their phones or by their computer, but most get them on their phones. And because they come across their phones, they are short bursts of information. So that's extremely influential in the understanding the content of the way that they receive news.
I think we've all been. I think those of us who do journalism, we've been talking for many years about the rise of citizen journalists. Right? Everyone can do it. Everyone can tweet. Everyone can blog. So the truth of the matter is, very little great investigative reporting has actually been produced by citizen journalists. It generally takes skilled journalists with a ton of editing and legal support and all of the rigor that goes into learning how to do this. I mean, like figuring out what happened is just phenomenally difficult, right? We talk about having a society based on truth and facts, and we say those things sort of glibly, but in fact, we all know, all of us know, how hard it is just to get things right? Just to get basic things right. Now, there's one giant exception to that, and that is really when it comes to the realm of police misconduct. And I would say one of the most important acts of journalism this year, I think we would all agree, was the 17-year-old kid who took the cell phone footage of George Floyd being murdered on a street in Minneapolis. And the thing that has come up over and over and over again is that investigative journalism, especially in the realm of police misconduct, has been aided over and over and over again by people, citizen journalists. I would say that was absolutely an act of citizen journalism, especially when you see that young person was being threatened by the police officers, like to turn it off, turn away, and they just stood there and kept that camera right on George Floyd. And that's happened right again and again and again in especially police misconduct cases. And it does show the interrelationship and the power of what happens when you put sort of citizen journalism together with actual real journalism. But when you put that into the sort of the political realm, I mean, I'd love to hear, Tamara, how would you describe, how citizen journalism has come into like your coverage of Donald Trump in the White House? Has it helped? Is it relevant?
I mean, there are definitely some citizen journalists who come to the White House on occasion and just sort of hang. No, I mean, certainly this isn't citizen journalism, but people's tweets from events and people's Instagrams from the president's golf resort is how we find out what he's up to at Mar-a-Lago. It's not citizen journalism. They're just bragging, but it's helpful. And I would say that when it comes to videos on the internet, for every one of those incredibly useful, valuable, important videos, there are any number of videos that are, edited in a way that turns it out into propaganda. And certainly David Thigpen, I think, knows more about this than I do in the work that you're doing with extremism. But, I see the ones that the president elevates. But there are so many of these videos that are misleadingly edited to make it look like, just insane violence in the streets when it was a little skirmish and it, involved people that were not who the caption says that it is. And so I think that this sort of the difficulty that many of us, certainly citizens, have in differentiating between something that is unfiltered and unedited and real and something that is designed to get your outrage up. I think this is one of the many challenges that are out there in this current environment, is that the water is so muddy.
Yep, I mean, that's absolutely right. And, I think it comes down to this question, and this will take us, part of the way there, is that we have to, as readers, we have to ask, where did this information come from? Right? Readers can be a great help in this problem. Where did this information come from? What is the history of this author? Do I actually know that this is true or not? Does this author provide any evidence, or is this just a statement? Right? If we begin asking those questions, then we're starting at least down the right path. Solving the larger problem is a challenge.
To another question from someone in the audience, given how false equivalency worked so strongly in Trump's favor, How should journalists work to avoid false equivalency in the future?
And I don't know, and maybe and you guys can correct me, but I don't know that false equivalency is what worked in Trump's favor. I think what worked in his favor was turning the airwaves over to him. I think what worked in his favor was that, and you know, favor, I guess, is all relative. He did win in 2016, but he didn't win in 2020. And in part, he was trying to run the same play, which is getting the base riled up. And you know, all of our fact checks were real cute to his base, but they didn't care, and they just thought we were being, you know, way too precious and like, you know, what you know, like what are you guys doing? Like getting so uptight about blah 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 or whatever it is this time. So I, you know, like I don't know that false equivalency was the thing that he weaponized, but maybe I'm misremembering.
I don't know, David Barstow, you talked about false equivalency at the New York Times and the move beyond it. And what are your thoughts?
I mean, I think that that journalists over the last 4 years, you know, just got increasingly aggressive about calling BS on out and out falsehoods and lies. And it's actually been very interesting. Actually, if you think about it, and you think about just the last 20 days, right? Boy, like there was no false equivalency over the last 20 days. Like people were there's like very little if you looked at the journalism that's been done around the last 20 days, there are very precious little out there in terms of false equivalency and saying, well, I wonder if Hugo Chavez really did pay money with George Soros to the Secretary of State, the Republican Secretary of State in Georgia, in order to flip thousands of votes in Georgia. Like that was just like, people were like, no, we weren't having that for a second. So I agree that like you really saw it, especially in these last 20 days, the sort of like if he was counted on false equivalency, man, did it not work for him. It didn't work for him in journalism. It definitely did not work for him in the courts. And I suspect like if he was really trying to get this ultimately in front of a Supreme Court, you know, you feel like that even that ground has been badly eroded for him.
I think in terms of his audience, there were a few truths that they valued at the top of everything. And then there were many truths below that mean nothing to them. And media truth is one of those things that are just not important to them. And the truths that are at the top are the few things that Donald Trump is consistent about, right? And that's about keeping immigrants out of the country, about setting back civil rights, about keeping Wall Street happy, right? So I think there's a huge coalition with one of those three things are there at the top, and everything else is way down the ladder, and that's why they would tolerate this blizzard of lies, because they're getting that one thing that's the most important to him. And I think we as journalists did not comprehend that. We thought that if we just corrected him and told the truth and pointed out the lies, somehow that would prevail. But that was never that was not a value on the part of many of his followers.
We have time for, we've got 5 minutes left for this event. So let me just ask one last question and we'll take one short response to it. Question, seeing as Trump, along with social media and a lack of media literacy education, have accelerated the erosion of a common ground of facts, do you think there's a possibility of recreating that common ground? And if so, how? In 2 minutes, who wants to take it up? I think it's a really good question.
It's such an important question. It's probably one of the most important projects that we as a country have to undertake in the next couple of years. And I think, again, the most important people who will help us do that work, in fact, are Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, whoever's running YouTube, and I mean, those the folks who actually control the social media platforms that are the kind of the perfect delivery device for conspiracies and just utter nonsense. And if those folks don't meet this moment, right, I really fear that the ability of like the reality-based press, which is like NPR, the New York Times, et cetera, we are vastly outgunned and out-resourced by the social media platforms. So I think first and foremost, the answer to this question starts right at Mark Zuckerberg's front door.
I would just add very briefly that although we are very obsessed with the institution of the press, many of our nation's institutions are degraded. And I would say even globally, but you know, people have fewer ties to the church, or they're more likely to believe what they read in a meme on Facebook than what their pastor or their rabbi tells them on Saturday or Sunday. There's a lack of connectedness. We've lost something, you know, and in large part to social media, in part because our institutions have failed in any number of ways and have not necessarily always admitted it, from the Boy Scouts to, you know, to journalism organizations up and down. But I think that part of repairing that connective tissue is local connections. That means local news sources, even if they're very grassroots. And I think it also means more community involvement beyond, you know, just Facebook groups.
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely repairable. And one thing that encourages me is I think young people, you can tell the way they comment on social media, they're many of them they're sort of in on the joke, right? They kind of realize it's a joke, and you can tell by the way they describe things. And I think that can be coaxed into restoring that kind of faith in information. So I think it's completely fixable. Journalism can help that.
On that very hopeful note, let me thank our audience for your engagement and your great questions and your eagerness for this dialogue that we just had with such passion. Thank you, Tamara, for being here, and David Thigpen and David Barstow. I'm so grateful that you took the time. We're also grateful that you took the time to discuss our school, our students' work, and your great work, and just the challenges for journalism, how we've struggled, and what it looks like going forward. And with that, let me just say thank you all. And
may I also say from the sidelines, thank you, Gita, and thank you for the entire community from the Graduate School of Journalism and our wider A+D community for engaging in this discussion. We've been talking about training students in media literacy for 1 decade, 2 decades, and now it seems like we're really at a new level here. And we know that the Graduate School of Journalism at Berkeley is going to be a force for making sure that all of us have the kind of new media literacy we need for the next decade. So thank you, Gita, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
bye.